You have seen the headlines. Ukraine is bopping Russia right and left. Yes, call it a big oil power play. But while the flames generate a bunch of splashy news stories, there are a bunch of subtleties to Kyiv's strategy, including why it will cause deeper economic problems for Russia, the mislabeling of kinetic sanctions, its weird interaction with secondary sanctions, and some complicated trade-offs for ceasefire negotiations. So, today, let's look at the bopping that Ukraine has done thus far, explore why the attacks are happening now, how this is actually two separate strategies that just so happen to have an energy overlap, who exactly is losing what, both inside and outside of Russia, why it could lead to bigger revenue cuts due to secondary sanctions, a warning about a middle ground ceasefire, and where a certain pink bird might take this in the near future. But let's begin with what is actually happening. And there is no better way to examine this than with a map. With some lines? Sadly, no. Not for us today. Or at least not yet. Instead, only flames. Now, a few things become apparent as the fires begin to populate the screen. One is the sheer volume. Two is that Ukraine is hitting the same targets multiple times. 3 is the long distance, though note that the attacks are still confined within the western half of the country. I am limiting the map to instances of damage to oil production and transport infrastructure. Not included are a bunch of attacks on military fuel depots, which are a more standard part of war. All told, we are looking at about a fifth of Russia's refining capacity going offline, though Ukraine may have hit a whole bunch more targets between me writing those words and you now hearing them. Actually, this one did just happen. Oh, wait, there's another. Safe to say that Ukraine is not messing around here. The immediate question that you might have after looking at the map is why this is all happening in the last month or so. You might remember that this is not the first Ukrainian campaign against Russian refineries. In fact, I was talking about the strategy quite a bit roughly a year and a half ago. Then the campaign just seemed to vanish. The Biden administration wanted Kyiv to cut it out because of the effect on global oil prices. Objections to the bilateral coercion problem between Russia and Ukraine aside, the then president did have a sensible political logic. Although we often speak of there being a regular and a gray market for oil, the two prices track each other. The gray market just has a discount because of the inconvenience. Keep this relationship in mind for later. For the current point, Biden worried that Ukrainian attacks on Russian infrastructure would raise gas prices for U.S. consumers, right in time for an election season. Hence the pleas to stop, even if it was not ultimately pivotal to the November vote count. Without the benefit of historical retrospect, Zelensky may have buckled in part over concerns of what would happen if Trump re-entered office, concerns that would only take a little more than a month to be vindicated. But it is puzzling that it took until August 2025 to get back on the strategy, approximately 9 months after the original purported blocking point no longer mattered. One perspective is that the Trump administration also wanted to keep gas prices low, but has since relented from that position, with a modest 25% tariff serving as a secondary sanction on India for importing Russian crude. But to use that exact same evidence to argue the opposite point, the fact that Trump has only implemented a 25% tariff on India, and not a higher number, and not on more countries, could also show that the United States is so tuned out of the war at this point that it does not matter if Kyiv does something contrary to Washington's wishes. There are also various leaked reports of Trump getting frustrated with EU leadership for not taking a stronger stance on the European countries still importing Russian energy products. More on that in a minute. One thing that we can be a little more confident about is that this is not purely a matter of Ukrainian military capacity. Some of the targets sit above ground, right there in the open. Ukraine has possessed the drones to hit them for quite a while, but has actively chosen not to. There is some discussion that Ukraine has dealt a serious blow to Russia's anti-air defenses in the recent months, so what we are seeing now are the more public fruits of that labor. But there remains a bit of a mystery on the timing question. In terms of what is happening, though, we need to talk about why this is actually two separate campaigns, not one. Back to the map. These are a series of strikes on an oil pipeline that runs west to Europe. If you were wondering how some European countries physically continue to receive their Russian energy drip, the pipeline is a big part of your answer. Pipelines like these can be easy targets for a bunch of reasons. My aforementioned point that some segments are above ground, they cover a long distance, and they are hard to defend using anti-aircraft fire because of that distance. Never mind that pumping stations are readily visible from the air. That is part of how we know that these attacks are happening. NASA keeps seeing the fires. The flip side is that pipelines and stations are quickly repaired. Consequently, if you want to keep them offline, you need a steady dose of attacks over a long period of time. Another fun fact. This image from a second ago is actually a Ukrainian segment of the pipeline. That's right, Ukraine could just turn a few knobs to shut off the oil for good if it wanted to. But because of the bizarre duality of international relations theater, that would be politically inconvenient. Once in Ukraine, that oil is owned by the purchaser. Attacking pipelines and stations in Russia, on the other hand, well, that is just an act of war on Russian oil, because the oil is still on that side of the border. European importers will continue to complain, of course, but financially, it is not Ukraine's problem. It is Russia's and the importers. Back to the map once again. This lone attack up here was on an export terminal. The rest are refinery attacks that you will see more often reported in the news. And here is where it is worth noting a distinction between these two categories. You may have heard the phrase kinetic sanctions to describe what Ukraine is doing, a not-so-subtle dig at the United States and Europe for not doing enough on that front, especially pointing to those European countries still importing Russian energy. However, only the pipeline and terminal attacks are hitting exports, as the sanctions label would suggest. The refineries primarily produce gasoline for domestic Russian consumption, so the bulk of the work there is more of a traditional counter-value strike than a standard sanction. And that connects to our next point. Who is actually losing out from these attacks, and by how much? The answer there is that it varies, both about which half of the campaign that we are talking about, and which victim. The export industry is easy to cover. For the pipelines, it is the angry European countries who have to figure out somewhere else to source their oil from, as though they did not have a few years to do that already. Then you can add the Russian government to the affected entities, as the oil money is no longer finding its way to the Kremlin. For that one terminal attack, you could add China and India to the list, and the Kremlin once again for the foregone cash. For the refinery attacks, though, it is a bit more complicated. One narrative is that Ukraine is trying to squeeze the fuel that runs the Russian war machine. Literally runs it, not figuratively financially runs it. And if the attacks continue for long enough, I am sure that at some point this will matter to the Kremlin. For now, gasoline is the primary commodity that is going up in flames. In contrast, most of Russia's military vehicles run on diesel. Not coincidentally, the Kremlin keeps an enormous stockpile of diesel on hand, because that is a normal thing for militaries to do, and Russia is not completely incompetent, as some memes might indicate. So we are far from a situation like at the end of World War II, where Japan reduced its air patrols because it did not have enough fuel to defend itself properly. It also does not have the same direct financial effect on the Kremlin. You see, the vast majority of refineries in Russia are there to serve Russian consumers. Little of the refined products leaves the country. Moreover, in a common strategy out of the petro-autocracy playbook, Russia subsidizes gasoline prices for its domestic consumers. The Kremlin may eventually feel the financial effects through a few more convoluted steps, but it will not be direct, as through pipeline sales. Safe to say that the Russian oil industry is a loser here as well. Part of the appeal of attacking a refinery is that it is high up on the energy supply chain. When Ukraine lights one on fire, it also implicitly lights on fire all of the capital that went into getting the crude out of the ground and to the refinery. It is also unclear whether Russia has enough tanker capacity to send abroad the crude oil that previously would have gone to the Russian refineries that are no longer capable of operating. The tankers are at the heart of the cat and mouse games with sanctions, so it is hard to keep track of this at any given moment. It is possible that we are in a period of tanker influx, though. One report indicates that about half of the 60 new and identified Shadow Fleet vessels are not under sanction. Bear in mind that Ukraine hit a terminal to keep that in check. Then you have Russian consumers who now face a shortage. Cars are forming long lines on streets at gas stations, and there are higher prices to match. Indeed, wholesale prices of gasoline are up 54% in Russia, a record high. This is a common problem for gasoline. Demand for it is inelastic, meaning that large price spikes only have a moderate short-run effect on the number of liters of gasoline sold. Plus, you get all of the domino effects. Gasoline is an input for so many other economic outputs, but all of those will vanish too if gasoline is not available. One interesting thing to note is that the majority of reports about shortages are coming from the Russian East. That seems like a bit of a puzzle when all of the damage is to the West. The obvious explanation is that the political centers of Russia are in the western half, so the Kremlin would want to make sure that they would be the last to feel the effects. That is surely part of the story, but let's go a couple of steps further. The West is also wealthier, so firms have an incentive to shift supply that direction and capture some windfall profits, or at least cut their losses. Remember as well that those in the East have disproportionately benefited from the war via higher wages. Consequently, any problems with gas are partially offsetting that, which continues to reduce the political risks to the Kremlin. In any case, this will not be an easy problem to solve. Russia cannot simply import gasoline to make up the difference. That would require infrastructure that would normally be silly to build in a country with massive oil reserves and ample refineries. Well, at least that would make sense if Russia were not at war. But Russia is at war, and so now it is a problem. Funny how that works. The main concerns for the Kremlin here are therefore the political problems that might come out of the situation. After trying to wrap the whole of Russia into the war with the mobilization call in September 2022, the Kremlin has shifted to making the invasion a primarily financial transaction, moving money from elites to those working in the war industry, plus workers in the broader economy benefiting from wage competition. That means that if you are an average Alexei on the streets or Misha at the metal plant, you can ignore what is happening in Ukraine if you want. Or maybe you can pay attention to it and celebrate it because of the extra money that you have coming in. Yeah, there is that whole inflation problem. Too bad if you are retired or otherwise living on a fixed income. But those who are still working can find themselves in a position where ignorance is bliss. Well, except not anymore. Everything else becomes unimportant if you cannot buy gas. That raises the possibility of popular uprisings and puts added pressure on Putin. Now, I realize the Putin is about to fall thing is a meme at this point, pushed by content creators because it drives engagement, but devoid of empirical purchase. Any Putin is about to fall theory is easily falsifiable by, waiting 2 weeks and seeing whether he falls. Safe to say that such claims have about as much credibility as the 2-week deadlines that the Trump administration keeps threatening the Kremlin with. So when I reference popular uprisings here, I am not talking about a takedown in the style of communist revolutions. In fact, longtime viewers would know that my stock media to mimic protests in Moscow are actually government-sponsored marches. Sorry, Putin is not actually protesting himself here, though notably these marches have not happened over the last 3 years in Moscow, in large part because amassing such large crowds poses a security risk to the state. Instead, what I am saying is that the shadow of real protests is enough to influence the Kremlin's thinking on the general Ukraine war project, and this is a pressure point that Ukraine has not seriously hit for more than 2 years. Consequently, the strategy has much more promise than continuing to impose day-to-day casualties on the front lines. I want to wrap up with 3 shorter points about some of the more convoluted implications of the strategy, beginning with oil pricing and secondary sanctions. I am not just talking about the 25% secondary sanctions on India here. I am also talking about the broader sanctions package that the Senate is in favor of, but Trump is constantly 2 weeks away from giving the green light to. The truth appears to be that 2 weeks is a no, and the news is that the US is too weak to take risks. Or at least that is a common interpretation of what the absence of movement there says about Washington. The structure of the sanctions is a flat punishment for importing any amount of Russian oil, not a penalty per barrel. Well, remember from earlier that the regular and gray markets track one another. The difference with the gray market is that, to entice customers, Russia must underprice its barrels to compensate for all of the hassle of breaking Western sanctions. The way that works for state-level import decisions and secondary sanctions is that the lost productivity for the sanctions must be amortizing across each barrel of oil. For example, if I import 1 million barrels of oil per day, and I lose $1 million a day due to the sanctions, then Russia would have to give me a $1 discount on each barrel to compensate. Given that, think about what happens if Ukraine could step up this campaign and significantly curtail Russian exports, say to 500,000 barrels per day. Well, secondary sanctions still cost me $1 million per day. Consequently, to compensate, Russia must now discount each barrel by $2. In turn, cutting Russian exports is a double whammy. Russia sells fewer barrels, and profits less on each of them. Moving on, our next subtle point is on negotiations over a partial ceasefire. This idea was floated once upon a time, and it is easy to think that it may come up again. Both countries pause the air war. Russia stops attacking Ukrainian cities, and Ukraine stops attacking Russia's energy infrastructure. It sounds like a win-win, but I would caution against what that does to the deeper bargaining dynamics. I have previously discussed how Ukraine can essentially absorb the damage from Russia's bombing campaign. It is perverse, I know, but stick with me. Ukrainians are resolved over the issues at stake, so the way they internalize the costs of war versus the land in play is minimal. Yes, Russia's attacks increase Ukraine's cost of war. It is just not by much. In contrast, Ukraine's attacks are reducing Russia's willingness to fight by imposing costs on a political group that the Kremlin has previously shown a concern about. The effect here would seem to be a comparatively larger increase to how the Kremlin views its own costs of war. Putting those pieces together, it is unclear whether such a partial ceasefire would benefit Ukraine, which in turn makes middling ceasefire proposals more difficult to get everyone on board for. No half measures. Finally, let's talk about some cute pink birds. Fine. We will continue to discuss weapons of war instead. Ukraine's new Flamingo missile has a range of about 3,000 kilometers. For perspective, Ukraine's longest distance attack this phase was only about 1,200 kilometers away. And while I think that some caution should be raised about overselling the value of a new weapon that has barely proven itself on the battlefield, and has a hype package coming from its producer, who has an ulterior motive to seek out capital investment, it still has a long range, and it is still huge. Part of why Ukraine hits refineries so much is that the refineries bring their own explosions. All Ukraine has to do is deliver a match. So you could imagine what a Flamingo hitting a refinery would do. But this creates another logistical problem for the Kremlin. Russia only has so many spare parts, and only so many qualified repairmen. If suddenly the number of refineries under attack doubles, repair times will not just double. They will backlog and start to get a whole lot worse. More subtly, the range of the Flamingo will add stress to Russia's air defense systems, which already seem ill-prepared for their task. Russia will have to spread things out further, something not easy to do when you are already spread thin. Put differently, there may be way more fireworks to come. Meanwhile, I do not recommend bringing these two books to a fireworks show. They are flammable, and it is hard to read in the dark. But check the video description and perhaps find a more suitable time for them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.